Hello, I'm Kevin Alderton, and this is our video, 5 minutes for small employers. I'm a director of X5 Chartered Accountants, and we're part of the Zenadin Group. Firstly, a quick disclaimer, this presentation is only for guidance. Please don't rely upon it in isolation. Take advice if you've got any doubts whatsoever, or if you really need a second opinion. We offer it, as do many other firms, and I refer you to my video which is called IR35, the new landscape, which is on our website, and that gives a much fuller account of the issues involved. The first question we're going to decide is there are new rules which commenced at the beginning of April 2021, and they seem to apply to everybody, but there is an exemption for a small employer. And the exemption is defined here. I've left a slide on the screen. You can stop the video to look at it in more detail, but really there are 3 tests: a turnover, balance sheet total, and number of employees test. And if you fall below 2 of these, then you're a small employer and you can rely on the exemption. If you're not, and this doesn't apply to you, please see our video, which is called IR35 for non-exempt employers. And you need to really follow the guidance in that rather than here. So if you're certain you qualify as a small employer, then on the face of it, the changes don't impact you. But there is some caution advised and some issues we need to think about. Firstly, in order to take advantage of the exemptions, your contractor must use a personal service company or an umbrella company. If they don't use that, then the exemption doesn't apply to you because you're outside the scope of the initial consideration of IR35 and you're into the area of general employment. Please be very careful. We come across so many people who misunderstand this all the time. If you employ an individual, you can't rely on this exemption. You have to use a PSC to pass that responsibility down to the company. An individual isn't assumed to have sufficient sophistication to understand, whereas a company is. That may seem odd, but that's how HMRC tend to regard it. So if the employee is an individual, IR35 and the exemption offers no protection. You cannot decide status just on your own or by agreement. We often hear things like, well, we agreed they would be self-employed, or we decided to treat them self-employed, or they said they prefer to invoice me. None of this works. Please let me emphasize, you cannot do this, and it's really important because it's something we come across time and time again, and HMRC are getting much tougher in their imposition of the rules. And if they find that you've got somebody who should be an employee and isn't being treated as such, particularly if they're an individual, they will have no compunction in charging you. HMRC charging you tax and national insurance, possibly going back years. We've seen it. Please be aware of it. Many employers think that the status rule don't apply, and there's some of the most common reasons we've given there. There are a whole lot more, but I've just cited a few examples. Number one is the contractor works for someone else as well. Does not mean they're not an employee. They send you an invoice. Similarly, they've told me they're self-employed, they give me their UTR. Well, they may well be self-employed in other contexts, but you have to look at the specific circumstances of each engagement to decide whether or not whether you should be treating them as an employee or as a self-employed person. Next is I don't operate PAYE. Unfortunately, it's not a club I can choose to join or not join. If you have somebody who's classed as an employee, you have to operate PAYE. They use their own tools or vehicle, and these sort of arguments, these are part of the test, which we'll come to in a moment. So there is a test which you can employ to apply to individuals as well as you can to companies. And you need to be really careful if you're employing an individual in this way and not treating them through the payroll. So here's the test that I mentioned. I put the link there. You have to answer the questions accurately and keep the result, because this is what you can potentially rely on if HMRC were to subsequently investigate and suggest that the individual was an employee rather than a self-employed person. Please keep it up to date. If the circumstances change, redo the test, because HMRC won't entertain an old test that's no longer applicable, particularly if they're looking at the substance of what happens and not the nature of the actual written contract. So there are cases where courts have looked around the contract and said, we don't really mind what the contract says. This is written to be outside the rules, but we're going to look at what's really happened. Oh, actually, you are inside the rules. You have to be very careful of that. And then even if the test does return the individual as self-employed, of course, the usual caveats, you must make sure they've got a national insurance number, a UTR, and the right to work in the UK. I hope that's been helpful. I put our contact details here. It's a big area. There's lots more we can say. And if you want any help or advice, do please contact us. I hope you found this helpful.